The evening light filtered through the dusty windows of the apartment above Ming family medical practice, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. Mai sat at her piano, her fingers hovering over the keys as muffled sounds of the city drifted up from the streets of Chinatown below. The smell of her father's evening tea, the same jasmine blend he'd drunk for 20 years, wafted under her door, but unlike the countless times before, she didn't join him. 2 years had passed since the day she placed her medical school acceptance letter on the kitchen table, alongside her letter of rejection. Her father, Dr. Ming, had stared at both papers, his weathered hands gripping his teacup so tightly she thought it might shatter. 25 years, he had said quietly, 25 years I've worked to give you this opportunity. The piano had always been her sanctuary, even when she was little. Back then, her father would smile at her practicing, calling it a wonderful hobby. He'd sit in his favorite armchair, nodding along as he reviewed patient files. But he never understood that for Mai, music wasn't just something to do between studying biology and chemistry. It was the very air she breathed. These days, the apartment felt more like two separate worlds divided by a thin wall. In one room, her father would see his private patients, his voice carrying the same warm, professional tone he perfected over decades of practice. In the other, Mai would teach her piano students, mostly neighborhood kids whose parents paid her in home-cooked meals and grateful smiles. She still remembered her last conversation with Grandmother Ming before she passed away. They had sat together on the old bench seat by the window, watching the lanterns being strung up for the autumn festival. "Your father," her grandmother had said, folding her small hands in her lap, "he sees the world through a doctor's eyes. Everything is either healing or hurting." She had patted Mi's hand then, her touch as light as a butterfly. Sometimes the greatest healings come from places he cannot see with his microscope. Tonight, like most nights, Mai could hear her father's evening routine through the wall. The gentle clink of his teacup, the rustle of medical journals, the soft creak of his chair. Once, these sounds had been the backdrop to their evening conversations about interesting patients, new treatments, or funny stories from the clinic. Now they were just reminders of the growing distance between them. She began to play softly, her fingers finding their way through a piece she'd been working on. It was something new, something that had been growing in her heart. A melody that spoke of family, of duty, of dreams that refused to be silenced. Through the wall, she heard her father's chair shift slightly, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she heard him humming along to an old tune, one her grandmother used to sing. The city lights began to twinkle outside her window, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. But in that small apartment above the family clinic, two people sat separated by a wall, both wondering if they'd lost something that could never be found again. Yet in the spaces between the piano notes, in the silence between the turning pages of medical journals, there lingered something that felt almost like hope. A song waiting to be heard, a bridge waiting to be built. Mai closed her eyes and continued playing, letting her music say all the things she couldn't find words for anymore. And somewhere, in another room, her father sat very still, listening to a language he had forgotten how to speak. The old cleaning cloth left trails in the dust as Mai wiped down the shelves in her grandmother's room. She hadn't planned to spend her Saturday night like this, but after a particularly frustrating day of failed attempts to compose new music, the urge to clean had overtaken her. There was something soothing about bringing order to chaos, even if it was just organizing old medical books and faded photographs. The room had remained largely untouched since Grandmother Ming's passing. Her father couldn't bring himself to change anything, and Mai understood why. Every object held a memory. The jade plant on the windowsill that her grandmother had nurtured for 30 years, the worn cushion on the reading chair where she'd tell Mai stories of old Shanghai, the delicate teacup collection gathering dust on the highest shelf. As she moved the heavy medical texts, generations of knowledge passed down through their family, something caught her eye. Behind the last row of books, tucked away like a forgotten dream, was a record sleeve. The cardboard was yellowed with age, its corners soft and frayed, but the image on the front was still clear. A woman in traditional Chinese opera costume, her face painted with elegant precision, her pose graceful and proud. Mi's hands trembled slightly as she pulled it out. She'd never seen this record before, had never known her grandmother owned anything like it. The date on the back read 1947, and beneath it was a list of songs performed by Lin Maihua, a name Mai had never heard of, but somehow felt she should know. But it was the handwriting in the margins that made her heart skip. Delicate Chinese characters, written in her grandmother's distinctive style, filled the empty spaces around the song titles. Mai squinted in the dim light, trying to make out the faded ink. Third position, arms like willow branches, breath from the diaphragm. Remember the pause before the highest note. Her fingers found the vinyl record inside, miraculously unwarped despite the years. In the corner of the room stood her grandmother's old record player, a beautiful piece of furniture that had always been more decoration than anything else. Mai had never seen it used, had assumed it probably didn't work anymore. She carefully cleaned the turntable, remembering how her father used to tell her that in medicine, precision and patience were everything. The same could be said for music, she thought, as she gently placed the needle on the outer edge of the vinyl. For a moment, there was only the soft crackle of dust and time. Then, like a ghost stepping out of a photograph, a voice filled the room. It was unlike anything Mai had heard before. Raw emotion wrapped in perfect technique, power contained within grace. The Chinese opera style was ancient, but something about it felt startlingly modern, achingly relevant. As the first song ended and the second began, Mai noticed more notes on the sleeve. Practiced this one behind the hospital after evening rounds. Father caught me once, said medicine was no place for singing. If only he could understand. Mai sat on the floor, the record sleeve in her lap, her grandmother's words blurring before her eyes. How had she never known? All those times her grandmother had supported her piano playing. Had she been seeing her own story play out again? The music continued to fill the room, each song a thread connecting past to present. Through the wall, she heard her father's footsteps pause outside the door. For a long moment, he stood there, and Mai held her breath, wondering if he would come in, if he would share whatever memories this music was stirring in him. The door remained closed, but he didn't walk away either. And so they stayed like that, father and daughter, separated by a door, but connected by a song that had waited decades to be heard again. In the growing darkness, Mai began to understand that some inheritances aren't written in medical books or legal wills. They're passed down in forgotten records and handwritten notes, in dreams that refuse to die, in melodies that skip generations to find their true home. Morning light streamed through the kitchen window as Mai pored over her grandmother's notes for the 100th time. She'd been up most of the night, carefully translating each character, each hastily scribbled memory in the margins of the record sleeve. Her usual morning tea had gone cold, forgotten beside a growing pile of notebook pages filled with her translations. First performance at the Golden Phoenix Theater, one note read. Mother brought me soup afterward, said my voice would bring shame to the family. But the audience stood and cheered. For one moment, I felt truly alive. Another entry, dated 1946. Dr. Liu says I have steady hands, perfect for surgery. Nobody sees how they shake when I pass the opera house. Last week, I heard they're looking for new singers. I pretend not to notice the posters anymore. The more Mai read, the more she understood. Her grandmother had lived two lives. In one, she was the dedicated medical student, then the respected doctor who would go on to heal thousands. In the other, hidden between hospital shifts and family obligations, she was a singer whose voice never got the chance to soar. Mi jumped at the sound of the clinic door opening downstairs. The morning patients would be arriving soon. She could hear her father's footsteps, the same pattern she'd grown up with: 5 steps to the office, pause to hang his coat, 3 steps to turn on the lights. Some things never changed, even when everything else had. She pulled out her phone and searched for Lin Maihua, the opera singer from the record. The results surprised her. Articles about a rising star in 1940s Shanghai who had toured America, bringing traditional Chinese opera to new audiences. There was even a grainy video clip, just 30 seconds long, but it was enough. The power in that voice, the way it seemed to reach across time itself, made May's heart race. Another note caught her eye, written in shakier characters, probably from her grandmother's later years. My granddaughter plays piano like she's telling stories. Today, she played Chopin, and I heard all the songs I never sang. I wonder if she knows she carries both medicine and music in her blood. The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the scattered papers on the kitchen table. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn honked, shaking Mai from her thoughts. She gathered the notes carefully, reverently, understanding now that she held more than just memories. She held proof that passion doesn't die, it just changes form. She thought about her father downstairs, preparing for another day of healing people, following in his mother's footsteps without knowing the full story. How many times had he heard her hum those opera melodies while treating patients? Did he ever wonder where she learned them? Mai walked to her piano, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Her fingers found the keys, and slowly, carefully, she began to play. But this time, something was different. Between the classical phrases she'd learned since childhood, she wove fragments of the opera melodies from the record. Western and Eastern, old and new, duty and dream. They weren't so different after all. The music flowed up through the floorboards of the clinic where her father was working. For a moment, his hands paused over a patient's chart. There was something familiar in the melody, something that reminded him of childhood evenings when his mother would sing softly while reviewing medical journals. Upstairs, May continued playing, adding her own voice to a song that had started decades ago. In her grandmother's handwriting, in her father's dedication to healing, in her own fingers on the piano keys. The same story played out again and again, generation after generation. But maybe this time, the ending could be different. She reached for her composition notebook, its pages blank and waiting. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote, "For Grandmother Ming, who taught me that some medicines come in the form of songs." Below that, she began to write notes, not in the formal style she'd learned at school, but in a new language that belonged to her alone, one that could speak of both healing and harmony. The concert hall hummed with quiet energy as the evening crowd filled the seats. Backstage, May adjusted the jade pin in her hair, her grandmother's favorite, the one she'd worn on special occasions. Her reflection in the dressing room mirror looked both familiar and strange, like a photograph from two different times merged into one. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, practicing until her fingers ached, and her neighbors probably knew the piece by heart. The composition had grown from those first tentative experiments at her piano, blending classical techniques with the emotional power of Chinese opera. Every note was a conversation between past and present, between duty and dreams. Through the curtain, she could hear the murmur of the audience. Her students from the neighborhood were out there. She'd recognized their excited voices earlier, their parents hurrying them to their seats. Old Mrs. Wu from the grocery store had insisted on coming, saying she wouldn't miss it for the world. Even some of her father's patients had bought tickets after seeing the flyer in the clinic waiting room. The flyer. She touched the wrinkled paper in her dress pocket, the one she'd secretly slipped under her father's office door 3 days ago. She hadn't signed it, had only written. A special performance dedicated to the memory of Dr. Ming Laiwei, who understood that healing comes in many forms. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened her grandmother's record sleeve one last time. The handwritten notes had become like an old friend over the past weeks, guiding her, encouraging her. "Remember to breathe from your core," one note read. "Let the silence between notes tell its own story." The stage manager appeared at her door. 5 minutes, he said softly, understanding the weight of the moment. Mee nodded, gathering her sheet music, though she hardly needed it anymore. The piece lived in her heart now, as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. Walking onto the stage felt like entering another world. The lights were warm on her face, the grand piano waiting like a trusted friend. She bowed to the audience, her eyes adjusting to the bright lights. That's when she saw him, her father, sitting in the back row, still wearing his doctor's coat. He must have come straight from the clinic. Their eyes met for just a moment before she turned to the piano. As she settled onto the bench, adjusting it with the precision her grandmother had always admired, the hall fell silent. May closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes were pure classical piano, a gentle invitation into familiar territory. But then, like a voice from an old record, the melody began to shift. Ancient Chinese opera phrases wove through the Western classical structure, creating something entirely new. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice guiding her. Music, like medicine, must flow like water, finding its own path while following the laws of nature. In the audience, people leaned forward in their seats. This wasn't what they had expected. It was something more. The melody spoke of hospital corridors and opera houses, of stethoscopes and stage lights, of choices made and dreams deferred. When she incorporated the main theme from her grandmother's favorite opera piece, she heard a small gasp from somewhere in the back of the hall. Her fingers danced across the keys, each note carrying the weight of 3 generations. She played for her grandmother, who had found ways to keep music alive in her heart while healing others. She played for her father, who had spent his life following a path laid out by duty and love. And she played for herself, finally understanding that some inheritances are meant to be transformed, not simply passed down. As the piece reached its final movement, May felt tears on her cheeks but kept playing. The music swelled into a passage that blended a traditional Chinese lullaby, one her grandmother used to hum while making dinner, with cascading classical arpeggios. In that moment, the barriers between East and West, old and new, duty and passion, seemed to dissolve. The final notes hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. For a heartbeat, the hall was completely silent. Then, from the back row, she heard it, a single person beginning to clap. Even before she looked up, she knew it was her father, standing now, his doctor's coat catching the stage lights as he brought his hands together again and again. The applause had faded, but the concert hall still buzzed with energy as people filed out into the evening. Backstage, Mai sat in her dressing room, her hands still trembling slightly from the performance. Flowers from her students covered every surface, their sweet scent mixing with the lingering emotion in the air. A knock at the door made her heart skip. She knew that knock, 3 gentle taps, the same way her father had always called her for dinner, for family meetings, for difficult conversations. "Come in," she said softly, watching the door through the mirror. Her father entered, still in his white doctor's coat, a worn leather briefcase in one hand. The briefcase had been her grandmother's, passed down when he took over the practice. He looked older somehow, standing there in the harsh dressing room lights, yet there was something different in his eyes, something she hadn't seen in years. "Your grandmother," he began, then paused, clearing his throat. "She used to sing that melody, the one in the middle of your piece. I never knew where it came from." His fingers tightened around the briefcase handle. "Until tonight." Mai turned to face him properly. "I found her record," she admitted, "behind the medical books in her room. There were notes, so many notes." Her father nodded slowly, placing the briefcase on a chair. With careful movements, he opened it and pulled out something wrapped in faded silk. "I have something to show you." As he unwrapped the silk, a photograph emerged. The edges were yellow with age, but the image was clear. A young woman in traditional opera costume, her face painted with the intricate patterns of Chinese opera, her pose confident and proud. It took Mai a moment to recognize her grandmother, so different from the gentle doctor she had known. "She gave me this the day I started medical school," her father said, his voice soft with memory. Told me to keep it safe, but I never understood why. Not really. He traced the edge of the photograph with his finger. She was so happy when I chose medicine, I thought. I thought that was all she had wanted for herself too. Mai reached for the photograph, and her father handed it to her carefully, as if passing on something much more precious than paper and ink. In the clinic, he continued, while treating patients, she would hum different songs for different treatments. The children especially loved it. They said her singing made the medicine work better. A smile tugged at his lips. Maybe they were right. She had a weight of healing that went beyond just medicine. I see that now. He paused, looking at his daughter with new understanding. I see that in you too. Mai felt tears welling up again, but these were different from the ones during her performance. I thought you'd be angry, she whispered, when I sent you the invitation. Her father shook his head. Your music tonight, it wasn't just playing. It was healing, in its own way. Your grandmother understood that. It took me much longer. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the concert flyer she had slipped under his door. This line about healing coming in many forms. Those were her exact words to me the day before she passed away. I didn't understand then. But listening to you tonight, the dressing room fell quiet, but it wasn't the heavy silence that had filled their home for the past 2 years. This silence felt like the pause between movements in a symphony, full of anticipation, of possibility. There's something else, her father said, reaching once more into the briefcase. He pulled out a small notebook, its pages dog-eared and filled with her grandmother's handwriting. I found this in her desk at the clinic. It's full of songs, her songs. She wrote down every melody she used for healing. Some are traditional, some she created herself. He held it out to her. I think she would want you to have this. Mai took the notebook with trembling hands. Opening it randomly, she found a page titled, For Fever and Chills. Gentle flowing melody in G minor. Below the notes were her grandmother's observations. The slow rhythm helps calm racing hearts. Remember to hum softly, like a mother's lullaby. Perhaps, her father said, watching her read, the clinic could use some music again. If you're interested. He straightened his coat, a doctor's habit of precision. Of course, you'll need to keep teaching and performing too. Your grandmother always said the best healing comes from a balanced spirit. The next morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the windows of the family clinic. Mai sat in her grandmother's old office, now her father's, surrounded by medical certificates and family photos. The room smelled of herbs and antiseptic. But today something else mingled with these familiar scents. The musty perfume of old paper from her grandmother's notebook of healing songs, open on her lap. Her father moved around the room, preparing for the day's patients. He paused by the window, adjusting his stethoscope. Your grandmother used this song for Mr. Chen's high blood pressure, he said, pointing to a page in the notebook. She said the rhythm matched the pace of a healthy heartbeat. I always thought she was being poetic, but now, he smiled slightly. Maybe there was more to it. Mai studied the notation, humming the melody softly. The tune was simple but calming, like waves washing against a shore. Did it help? She asked, imagining her grandmother singing quietly while checking a patient's pulse. His numbers always seemed better after her appointments, her father admitted. At the time, I credited the medicine. But perhaps, he trailed off, lost in thought. Then he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an old appointment book, its pages yellow with age. Look at this. The book fell open naturally to a well-worn page. In her grandmother's careful handwriting, beside each patient's name, there were small musical notes, different symbols for different conditions. She had a whole system, her father explained, his voice filled with wonder. All these years, I never really looked. I was too focused on following the traditional medical path. From the waiting room came the sound of the front door chiming. The first patient of the day had arrived. Mai started to close the notebook, but her father held up his hand. "Stay," he said, "if you'd like to. Maybe we could try something new." The patient was a young mother with her crying baby. The infant had an ear infection, nothing serious, but was clearly uncomfortable. As her father examined the baby, Mai began to hum one of her grandmother's melodies marked for soothing pain, Gentle Lullaby in D major. Gradually, the baby's cries softened to whimpers, then ceased altogether. The mother looked up in surprise. "That's amazing," she said. "He's been crying all morning. Would you mind teaching me that tune?" Mai glanced at her father, who nodded encouragingly. For the next few minutes, while he prepared the prescription, she taught the simple melody to the mother. Music has its own kind of medicine, she found herself saying, echoing her grandmother's words from the notebook. Sometimes the heart needs healing as much as the body. As the morning continued, more patients arrived. Each time, Mai found a melody from her grandmother's notebook that seemed to fit. Her father worked with his usual careful precision, but now he would occasionally pause, listening to the music, sometimes even humming along as he wrote prescriptions or checked vital signs. During a quiet moment between patients, he turned to her. "I've been thinking about the space next to the waiting room," he said, gesturing through the door. "It's been used for storage, but it could be a music room. For teaching or practice, or," he adjusted his glasses, a habit she recognized from childhood when he was trying to express something difficult, "or for healing, in your own way." Mai felt her heart skip a beat. "You mean?" "Your grandmother once told me that medicine isn't just about curing illness. It's about treating the whole person." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "I think I'm finally beginning to understand what she meant." A knock at the door interrupted them, another patient waiting. But before Mai could move, her father asked, "Would you stay? Help me with today's appointments. We could try doing this together." She looked around the room, at the medical diplomas on the walls, the family photos on the desk, her grandmother's notebook of healing songs, the morning sunlight making patterns on the floor. Everything was exactly as it had been yesterday, and yet everything had changed. "Together," she agreed, opening the notebook to a new page. As her father called in the next patient, she began to play a gentle melody on the small electronic keyboard they'd brought in from home. The music filled the clinic with something that felt a lot like hope, like the beginning of a new kind of healing. 1 year later, the Ming family clinic had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The waiting room, once silent except for the rustle of old magazines, now hummed with gentle melodies. Mai's grandmother's piano had found a new home there, positioned perfectly so the music could flow through the entire space. The morning sun streamed through newly installed windows, warming the wooden floors as Mai prepared for her first appointment. Her practice room, converted from the old storage space, had become a unique blend of music studio and healing space. Sheet music shared shelf space with medical reference books, and her grandmother's notebook of healing songs held a place of honor on the piano. "The little one with the asthma is coming today," her father called from his office, not looking up from his patient files. "The one who likes the butterfly song." Mai smiled, remembering the tune her grandmother had written specifically for children with breathing problems. The melody mimicked the gentle flutter of butterfly wings, encouraging slow, steady breaths. These days, her father didn't just tolerate the music. He prescribed it, working with Mai to match specific songs to different treatments. Their unique approach had caught attention. Other doctors visited, curious about how music and medicine could work together. Some were skeptical at first, just as her father had been. But then they'd sit in on a session, watch a nervous child relax during vaccinations as Mai played, or see an elderly patient's trembling hands steady as they followed a rhythm. The clinic's walls now held 2 sets of certificates side by side, medical licenses and musical achievements. Between them hung a newly framed photograph, her grandmother in her opera costume, alongside a program from Mi's latest concert. Below these was a sign that read, "Healing comes in many forms," written in both English and Chinese. That morning, as patients began arriving, Mai started with her grandmother's favorite melody, the one that had started everything. Her father, checking his schedule at the front desk, began humming along without even realizing it. The sound of their voices blending together made the old nurse smile as she updated patient charts. A young girl waiting for her appointment watched wide-eyed as Mai played. "Could you teach me?" she whispered during a pause between songs. Her mother, a regular patient, explained that the girl had been afraid of doctors until they'd started coming here. Now she looked forward to visits, saying the music made the medicine taste better. Mi glanced at her father, who nodded. "We have time before your checkup," she said, patting the piano bench beside her. As she showed the girl simple finger positions, her father watched from his office doorway, his expression soft with understanding. Later that afternoon, during their lunch break, they sat together in the kitchen above the clinic, sharing tea like they used to years ago. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the kind of peace that comes from finding your own path while honoring those who came before. "Your grandmother's old record player arrived today," her father mentioned, sliding a package across the table. "I had it restored. Thought we could keep it in the waiting room, next to her piano." Mi carefully unwrapped it, revealing the gleaming wooden cabinet she remembered from that life-changing night of discovery. "We could play her opera recordings," she suggested, "along with the new pieces." Her father nodded, then added softly, "I've been thinking about those notes she wrote about healing rhythms matching heartbeats. There might be something there worth studying from a medical perspective. Perhaps." He adjusted his glasses. "Perhaps we could work on a research paper together. Your music theory combined with my medical background." Mai reached for her grandmother's notebook, its pages now filled with both old songs and new ones she composed herself. "A bridge between two worlds," she said, just like she tried to build. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor, and from below came the sounds of the clinic coming back to life after lunch. Footsteps, quiet conversations, and always the music. In the corner, the jade plant her grandmother had tended for so many years has sprouted new leaves, growing in its own time, in its own way. That evening, as they prepared to close the clinic, a new patient asked about the photograph of the woman in the opera costume. Mi and her father shared a look, then began to tell the story, their story, of how a forgotten record had helped them discover that some medicines come in the form of songs, that healing can flow through many channels, and that sometimes the greatest discoveries lie in the spaces between what we think we know and what we have yet to learn.